Hello, and welcome to this session of the Sibling Leadership Network Conference. Hashtag Hear Our Voices, Disabled People of Color, and Allyship. My name is Chris Bursler, and I will be your moderator for this session. Just as a reminder, if you have a camera and it's on, we can see you. If your microphone is on, we can hear you. So please make sure to mute yourselves. Please use the chat box for any questions that you may have. The presenters will do the best they can to answer the questions in the chat box, but may not be able to get to every question due to the time restraints of this session. As a further reminder, the session is being recorded and will be available to SLN members in the online archives. I am placing a link in the chat box now to any conference handouts. Now I will turn this over to our wonderful presenters. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our presentation, Supporting People of Color with Disabilities as a Sibling or Ally. The purpose of the presentation is to address the intersection of race, disability, and people of color with disabilities can be marginalized because of their two identities or multiple identities. We will also provide ways to support people of color with disabilities in times of increased racism and ableism. So we will not only help you all address how race and disability can intersect, but we can also provide ways to help support your loved ones with disabilities, and also how to bring up the conversation of racism and ableism to loved ones. Before we begin, we will introduce ourselves.
Greetings, everybody. My name is Jay Jinpak. I am the Community Education Training Coordinator at UIC's Institute on Disability and Human Development. I also am the Self-Advocacy Training Coordinator at the Illinois LEND program, also out of UIC, and the proud co-founder, along with TJ, of the Chicagoland Disabled People of Color Coalition. And I identify as a cisgendered male using he, him pronouns, as an advocate, educator, and ally, as well as an Asian American immigrant with multiple disabilities. So it's great to be here.
Hi, everyone. My name is Timotheus Gordon Jr., also known as TJ Gordon. And if you're looking at my picture right now, then my description is me as a smiling African-American cis male sitting down on a base chair with a short black afro, glasses, medium complexion, and a black shirt. If you are looking at me on screen right now as I'm speaking, then my description is the same as, almost exactly the same in the picture, except I have locks instead of a short afro, and I'm wearing a gray t-shirt. I am a research associate at UIC's Institute on Disability and Human Development. My primary job is to create trainings and guides that can help people with disabilities get included in the community. And I also use those similar tools in addressing COVID-19 in marginalized communities and more. In addition, I am a self-advocate, an autistic self-advocate, and a writer. Along with Jay Jin, I am a co-founder of Chicagoland Disabled People of Color Coalition, or Chicagoland BPOC. We are a group of disabled people of color in the Chicagoland area that promotes disability pride, disability acceptance, and inclusion in communities of color throughout Chicago. And for a bonus, I am a father to one son named Othello, also known as Theo. I am a godfather to my friend's daughter, Lauren, and I am an uncle to many nieces and nephews. So, yeah. So, we will spend the first part of the presentation talking about the intersection of race and also disability, but it's all rooted in lots of isms that we face in society, whether it's ableism, sexism, homophobia, basically anything that oppresses marginalized people who are not white, cis male, and privileged, and not able-bodied. Racism and ableism, along with other forms of oppression, are interconnected. We should not treat those as separate issues. Some way or form, racism and ableism are connected. For instance, as a African American male with autism, not only that people could marginalize me because of my color and my size and the big black athlete stereotype, I could also be marginalized because of how I think and process information. Oppression is linked to the power of state institutions such as the police, the school systems, and you can even say, even though it's not by the state per se, you can even say religious institutions that as well. Oppression is also linked to ideals of white, able-bodied, and cisgendered people. What I mean by cisgendered people is people who are comfortable with their gender assigned at birth. In my case, I will consider myself a cis male because I am comfortable with the sex and gender assigned to me at birth. While we talk about intersectionality so much, we may ask, it's a word that's thrown around a lot these days, especially with George Floyd and other instances of police violence. Oppression can happen to a person in different levels based on their identities. So it goes back to the notion that oppression is not just one thing you face, but you may face multiple things at the same time based on who you are or who you identify as. For instance, if you in a Latinx community, you are not only exposed to racism in their own community or in the workplace or outside of that community, but that person could also be subjected to homophobia if they're in the LGBT plus community, sexism, transphobia, ageism, and much more. So depending on how many identities you claim, you may or may not be subjected to various forms of oppression. Racist and ableist ideas can be based on white supremacy ideologies and how certain ethnic groups view race and disability. So racist and ableist ideas does not come from a vacuum. It comes from a place where certain ethnic groups have certain set of values that they uphold. While there is nothing wrong with being proud of your culture and holding on to your ideals, it becomes oppressive when you tell other people that they need to fit the mainstream culture. You need, in this case, you need to fit the white and able-bodied culture. If you're not in that culture, then you're nothing. And that's where the biases and essentially the oppression comes from, based on how one majority group sees themselves and also how they control people around them. Sometimes people with disabilities may not have the things they need because of barriers set by racism and ableism in their communities. So on one hand, for instance, let's say if you need treatment for or you need physical therapy for cerebral palsy, for instance, it can't go in your neighborhood because more likely it's not going to be available in your community. You have to go to another community who has it, usually more affluent. From a race and economic standpoint, it's the narrative is pretty much this. In order to go to the best hospital or get the best care, you had to go to a more affluent, more Eurocentric community. If you're in a community of color, then more likely you're not going to get the quality of services or things you'll need. In addition, even if a community has what you need, you may not be able to get the things that you need because of how people within the community view disability. Community members may use disability to segregate people who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Yes, even people of color get discriminated in their own community based on ability. So there's this long-standing myth in the Black community that the coolest Black folks are athletes, performers, or on the criminal side, gangsters and pimps. That part of it comes from the racist notion that Black people are meant to entertain. They're meant to use their bodies. If a Black person do not use their bodies or their hands to make a living, then they're nothing, even if they have more of intellectual or academic pursuits. And ableism in that sense could be, if you're not able-bodied in the Black community, then you're worthless. There are many effects that racism and ableism could have on people with disabilities. There's lack of accessibility and inclusion in their communities. even if you're in a community of color or an ethnic community, if there's no access to the things you need or want or things that you want to enjoy in your community, you feel isolated. You don't know where to go because you are marginalized. Add the accessibility part. If you want to go to church, for instance, but there's no ramps or there's not a place to decompress after a long service, there's lack of accessibility in that regard, where that place is not accommodating to your disability. That lack of accommodation and inclusion is even more dire and scary if you one of the few people of color in a mostly white neighborhood. There's also lack of resources for people of color with disabilities to thrive. Again, going back to, if you had to travel to another community, especially to like a more affluent and Eurocentric community, to get the support and resources you need, then that says something about how ableist the community is and how racism affects your home area. Or let's say if you live in a affluent area, but because of your color of your skin and your ethnicity, you can't get the resources. So it goes to the ultimate effect, which is because of the lack of resources for people of color with disabilities to thrive, because of the lack of accessibility and lack of inclusion, you'll feel oppressed and isolated from your own community, from the mainstream community, which is Eurocentric and white, and you'll feel isolated from able-bodied people. That's a lot to deal with as a person of color with a disability. But there's some other effects as well. Some siblings or some family members and allies may hold ableist or biased or racist beliefs that could affect the relationship of people with disabilities. So your parents or grandparents may be accepting of you because of your disability, but your siblings or other family members may have racist and ableist thoughts about people of color that is passed down. And while some may is trying to be nice and try to connect, there's still those beliefs that hold them back from fully connecting with people with disabilities. Whether the siblings and allies believe, some of them believe in, oh, the person can't do this, the person is not worth it because they can't do certain things, or oh, he's whiter than he's supposed to be because he's a different person. That sort of thing could affect the relationship between siblings, family members, and allies. And part of it is bias, but also part of it is also because they just don't know what the disability is due to lack of resources and information, accurate information about what's going on with, or what could go on with the person with a disability, not just from a medical standpoint, but also from a social, economical, and relational standpoint. there's also lack of support for allies and siblings of people of color with disabilities also, because of the lack of information in communities, along with fear and bias in some communities. Allies and siblings may not get the support they need in their own community. And even if they go to a larger support system, they may be faced with ableist and racist biases from some of the people in that community. So I mean, they not able to, therefore they're not gonna get the support they need because they feel uncomfortable in that larger setting, or the setting that's more Eurocentric and white. Also take to consideration the lack of support for allies and siblings from the disability organization. Again, there's a lot of organizations out there where family members push for supporting their disabled loved ones. But due to cultural differences, due to economics, which also ties into cultural differences, and there'll be more misunderstandings that comes within allies and siblings in the organization, and it can alienate allies and siblings of color in particular. So now we will transition from naming racism and ableism that disabled people of color face, as well as siblings and allies of loved ones with a disability, to how to discuss racism and ableism to your loved one with a disability, and also how can you be a ally and a supportive sibling and family member to your loved one in combating ableism and racism. I will now hand it over to Jay Jin, and he will get into that topic in more depth.
Thank you, TJ. And as TJ so eloquently shared in the last few minutes, just the reality that it's important to acknowledge that racism and ableism and oppressive systems still are part of our society, that we have to acknowledge that they're there, and that as siblings, as people with disabilities, as allies, as much as we fight and advocate for disability justice and rights and equality and equity to be seen and heard as disabled people, and as siblings fighting and advocating for our loved ones with disabilities to be seen and heard, we don't live in a silo. As TJ shared, there is intersection. Those of us who live at the intersections of identifying as a person with a disability, as well as a person of color, different faiths or sexual orientations, any marginalized community, were hit with different types of oppressive systems. And it's important to talk about them and acknowledge them. And acknowledging them doesn't necessarily mean that you accept responsibility if you're not, actively being racist or ableist or oppressive. It just means that you are willing to acknowledge that these exist. So, if you have the open-mindedness and the willingness to talk about racism and ableism, it is also important to acknowledge that talking about these isms can be difficult. It can be painful. That as you as we live in our society and we consume news and social media, we're going to hear stories of people that we may know or people within our communities, as well as whole strangers who've experienced racism and ableism. And it can be painful, and it's okay to acknowledge that, but it's also important to still make the effort to listen and then to talk about it and to share. And through that conversation, it's a way of working a process to find ways of showing support and building allyship. Just as, through this conference, you're talking about siblings and supporting your loved ones, your brothers and sisters with disabilities, and fighting ways of supporting to advance disability rights and equity against ableism. It's that same kind of energy of willing to talk about it that will bring about a change of fighting for and fighting against racist ideas. Similar approach, different ideas. And having said that, I by no means am implying that they're equal. They're not equal. They're just similar in terms of the approach. So, and some of the bottom statement of the message that some assume that people with disabilities may not understand or care about or care to recognize racism and ableism. These are some common myths, just as we all struggle and battle the myths of people with disabilities not understanding, of not being able to process. It's not important for us with disabilities to know about certain topics because of the stigma. It's important to acknowledge that that's a bad message, and it's a false message that is fed by ableist ideas. This idea that because we have a disability, we're somehow different and less than, and because we're different and less than, we're undeserving. Just like if you're a person who has a person of color, a different faith tradition, sexual orientation, those stigmas of you're less than, you're less deserving. Again, similar attitudes, negative ideas that we counter. And if you, as a brother and sister and parent, are fighting against the notion that your loved one is seen as less than, then you already have the same idea and the same energy to fight against racism. Next slide. So we're talking about those ideas. And if we can go to the next slide, DJ. Let's talk about some practical ideas and how to bring up racism and have a conversation. And there's a lot of information, a lot of TED Talks, a lot of literature, and a lot of really good information that we would encourage you to investigate and read for yourselves. But some of the core ideas and kind of values to keep in mind to have these conversations with each other, as well as with your loved one with a disability, is just to be honest. Make the intention to be honest and say, this stuff is here. Yes, it's real. Yes, it's important to acknowledge that ableism and racism and sexism and all the oppressive systems are real and they're happening. Be direct. It's okay to say racism is bad, sexism is bad. It's happening in our community. It's happening in it. There may be examples of racist or sexist messages, jokes, ideas, even in our own families. Again, acknowledging it is important. And if you acknowledge it, you can also acknowledge that, yeah, it was a mistake. Yes, these sexist ideas or sexist attitudes that I may have held at one point in my life, I now acknowledge I was wrong, and make that effort to acknowledge that. To be clear, be direct. Again, avoid euphemistic language, avoid minimizing. You know your loved ones best and how they communicate and how they process. So use that knowledge to communicate in the way that your loved one with a disability can understand, in the way that is clear for them, direct for them, that yes, racism is happening. If you want to talk about it, yes, what you saw on social media is an example of racism or ableism. Yes, this happened. And open the opportunity for them to ask questions. One thing that's also important to acknowledge is that having this conversation doesn't mean you're going to fix it. Doesn't mean that we have to make it all better, because it's not going to happen overnight, as we all know. It's the idea that this is just an ongoing process, that if we talk about it, we acknowledge it, we're honest, direct, clear with each other, and we understand that ableism, that the bullying that we experience as someone with a disability because of our disability, because of the name calling, because of our disability, that's ableism. It's the same negative attention and as someone who is made fun of because of their skin color. That's racism. It's the same kind of negative, bad situation as ableism. And if that helps your loved one with a disability understand that connection, then that's a start. Okay, and let's move on to the next slide. As we round up and we can finish talking about ways of supporting and working toward anti-racist and anti-ableist as an ally. And again, some key things to keep in mind to help guide and frame our efforts is make the intentional decision to listen. Listen to people of color. Listen to other disabled folks. Hear their stories. Hear our stories, our experiences, and just hear without judgment, without filters, just hear and be willing to listen to that. As you hear, learn about diverse communities. Take the time to explore and connect with different communities in your hometown, in your home countries, in your home cities. Connect with other diverse communities. Attend art and cultural activities or museums, and just start that process of learning about each other. A big step is dismissing stereotypes. We live in this social media constant misinformation, exaggerated information. It's important to dismiss the stereotypes and the misinformation. And along with that is question the messages and ideas that we see on social media, especially if they're not cited or if they seem over exaggerated, is to just be critical of that and help people with disabilities, help your loved ones with disabilities question and encourage them to ask questions. How real is this? How believable is this? How factual can this be? As opposed to just blindly believing what they see on news or Facebook or on social media. And as you incorporate these ideas of listening and learning and dismissing stereotypes and being critical and questioning, ultimately moves to the idea of including and connecting to diverse communities. Go out, take a little risk and go outside your comfort zone and connect with just communities that you may not be actively connected with. Doesn't mean you have to dive in, all the way, but just take little steps to build connections. And again, this whole idea is it's an ongoing process. A little bit here, a little bit there, and before long, within time, you'll get to a point where you've connected with different communities, you've learned, and you've shared your community and your heritage and your culture with them as well. So it's a two-way street. Okay. Next. So again, this whole conversation that we've had together is in our short time, we've covered a lot. And it is our hope that this is just a little reminder, a bit of encouragement, and some touchstones for you to take and use to explore and do your own investigations. And if you have questions and you want to contact us individually, on the screen is our information. You can reach me at my email at jjpak@uic.edu, and you can see TJ's email as well. Thank you so much. We're happy to have been part of this conference, and thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much to our presenters, Jay-Jin and TJ. It was amazing. If you had a question, I think we tried to answer it in the chat box. I apologize, we have to cut this short and go back to the room. Sorry, not go back to the room. I am including links to the next event, which is the tabletops. So thank you for everyone for joining, and thank you to our presenters.